So I'm going to talk about some lessons that I learned reading various code samples and things. But before I get started, let me just introduce myself. I'm John Kilmister, and you can find me on Twitter at John Kilmister. I also have a blog at blueboxes.co.uk where there is actually today a post on this very topic that goes into a bit more detail. So we're going to talk about the lessons of reading code in 23 languages. But before we do that, we're going to quickly cover why we should be caring about reading code. We're going to talk about the code reading challenge that I did that kind of led me to reading code in so many different languages. And then most of it, we're going to focus on the actual techniques that you can use to read unfamiliar code, hopefully all in 15 minutes. So why recode? Well, as engineers, DevOps people, QAs, we're going to be spending about 60% of our time understanding code rather than writing it. And this can come in a whole set of forms. You could be reading a pull request from a colleague. You could be joining a new company or a new team that's using a different language or code you wrote yesterday. We all have to go back and reread the code that we've done on a previous day. And these three are generally in languages that you're familiar with, in constructs and coding standards that make it easy to read. But then you've also got things like legacy code. I was once given a C++ application to modify, having never written it. You also have open source code. I mean, we're using things like Terraform, and you might want to go and dive into that code and actually see if there is a bug or change that you want to contribute. And that'll be in a completely different language that you're using on a daily basis. And then we've got code samples. How many times have you searched and ended up on Stack Overflow only to find the perfect answer, but it's in a different language? So we want to be able to understand how we can read unfamiliar code quickly and not necessarily become an expert in that language, but get a gist and understand what it's trying to achieve and why it's trying to achieve that. Now, back in December, I came across a tweet from the Code Reading Club, and it talked about this code snippet and a code challenge. I quickly learned that they were running a code challenge over the month of December, and every day they'd post a few lines of code with a simple question that you had to answer. So 24 days, 24 snippets of code. Well, that sounded interesting. I'd been an engineer for many years and was reading lots of different languages. I thought, this is going to be easy. Bit of fun, takes a few minutes. And it started off not too bad. First example in JavaScript, I mean, it's regular expressions, but I could answer the question, are these four regexes the same? And the answer was yes. I just quickly verified it, and that was day one, done. Things got a bit more complicated. This is Python, not a language I use on a daily basis, but I can answer the question of what assumptions the author made. I think if you're used to languages in this kind of format, you can see they're looking for arg1, arg2. It's kind of the assumption that there are going to be two args. So things went on, and then I was presented with some Scratch code, and yeah, I'm kind of familiar with Scratch, relatively straightforward, until I actually looked at it and realized the variables weren't in English. And how do we actually work out what this code is actually doing? So yeah, that went on. And then I was eventually presented on day 15 with this code, which is APL. And APL isn't something that I'd ever even heard of before. And it doesn't even use English words. So I was like, where do I even start with this? And throughout the challenge, we went through a whole range of languages, some of them familiar to me, some of them similar, like Java and some of the other languages. And then some of them I'd never even heard of. So that was this challenge that I undertook. And during that month, I picked up lots of new techniques and also kind of used techniques that I'd used throughout my whole career. And I wanted to spend the remainder of this presentation sharing some of those techniques and skills that I used and that I went on to learn. I haven't got time to cover all of them, so I've just picked kind of a top 4 or 5. The first one is understanding the basics of the language. Pretty much every language exists for a reason. And the first thing is to work out what type of language it is. Is it functional? Is it a scripting language? Is it compiled? Why was it created? And what is it good at? If you start to understand why the language exists, it can help you understand why it's been kind of formatted and constructed in a certain way. And then what are the key features? What do variable declarations look like? What are the different data types involved? This is an example of Elm and the Elm documentation, but it's common with pretty much all the languages. You can find a getting started guide pretty quickly. And for the majority of the languages that I hadn't come across before, that was my first point. Find out the basic constructs in that language. Because if it's a functional language, it's going to be written in a completely different way than if it's a scripting language, for example. So reading the documentation to get you started is important, but then we also have to read the documentation to dive into what individual operators look like. On day 11, there was this SQL example here, and it asked, what's the difference between these two queries? And you might know the answer, or you might not. But in my case, I recognized it. I could see there was some sort of pattern matching going on. And the main difference here is we've got some underscores and some percents, but I didn't know what that meant. But I went to the documentation for pattern matching and I pulled out the information that I needed. And we could see that an underscore pattern matches any single character, while a percent sign matches any sequence of 0 or more characters. And then we could answer the question relatively straightforward. So to answer these, it's not always necessary to learn the language in full. It's about finding the right bits of information and extracting that. And the documentation is a great place to start, even if we not like using documentation. The next one is using an editor to syntax highlight. So we take this code, which was a PHP example. Yes, I can read it. However, if we put it into a text editor, or more precisely an IDE that supports syntax highlighting, all of a sudden it starts to light up and we can see in this case what's a string and what's a variable. So even if it's not in a language that we're familiar with, we can start to see the important parts and it can start to highlight things that we might want to search further on. The next tip is use what you already know. So this sample popped up and it's in a language called GCL, but that's kind of irrelevant in this case. I did some initial investigation around GCL, but the question was, what sorting algorithm is that? Well, as a software engineer, I'm familiar with a number of sorting algorithms. So I could use what I already know about the different sorting algorithms and go through them one by one, comparing it to this code and saying, does that look like a bubble sort? Is it doing the actions that we'd expect to see in a bubble sort? And in this case, actually the answer was that it is. But I also went through the other algorithms at a very high level and just kind of work that out. So you can often use knowledge of things that you already know along with a code sample to kind of narrow down what it's trying to do. The next one is code converters. So much like Google Translate, there are online code converters that will take one language and turn it into another language. Now, it's not going to take disparately different languages, but if you've got something like Python here, we can turn it into C# using online converters. And in some cases, this might help you identify how it's working. I've used this before with just very small snippets of code just to go, is that exactly what I think it is? Online compilers and converters. So these are really handy. To set up a new language on your machine used to be a real effort, and especially if it's not one you're familiar with. But we can now use online compilers like try.net or this is the APL example, or even Logo, if you remember back from sort of the 80s and 90s. And you can just start writing code and executing code. And this is a great way of testing things out. We'll see that a bit more at the end. So that's just a handful of the techniques. But I wanted to take one of the questions, probably one of the most complicated questions, and put it all together and show you how I worked through it. So this is that APL question. APL's grade operation can be used to sort. What does its output mean, and how can it be used to sort a value? Well, this code snippet for me raised a range of questions. First of all, what is APL? What is this grade operator that's being talked about? But then looking at the code, I also see a V and an arrow, and I'm trying to answer that question about sorting. So the first thing I did was learn what APL was at a really high level. And I learned that it was a language from the 1960s that is all based around two-dimensional arrays. And from that, I then searched up a bit more and learned that actually there are no words in the APL language. Everything's based on symbols, to the point where they actually had a symbol keyboard for coding it. And some of the APL characters are actually part of the Unicode standard. Now, this didn't help me answer the question, but it gave me a bit of a background. I searched for that character, the grade operator, but it didn't really get me very far. But I knew about the grade that I was looking for, grade up. So I found some online documentation, and it explained what the grade up operator does. It sorts the array. So you give it the grade up symbol and then a set of numbers, an array of numbers, and it will sort it. But interestingly, it will actually not return you the sorted list of numbers. It returns the indexes of the numbers that would be sorted, which was very confusing. And that's where the online editor came in, and I could actually start testing it. So as you can see down the bottom here, I put grade operator 316. I ran it, and it returned 213. So the first item in the list is the second index, the number 1. The next item is the first index, number 3, and the third item is the third item in the array. So that answers the question of how the grade operator works. It returns the indexes of the items, and that's how it sorts it. So I could then go on and answer the question. So that was just a really quick run through of how I answered that particular question. But I followed a similar principle in answering a lot of the other ones. And a lot of it is about finding out, understanding you don't need to understand the entire language, but it is good to look back at what the purpose of the language is, how it's structured. Does it have functions, and does it have variables and various other bits and pieces? And then read through the documentation to answer the question that you're trying to do. It might not be a quiz question like these were, but it might be that you're being asked to rewrite the code, and you've got a functional specification and you're trying to match that up with the old legacy code that you're trying to rewrite. So what if you want to read or learn some more about reading code? Well, as I mentioned, I've written a blog post that I've published today on this topic, and it goes into a few more techniques that I learned through the process and have used over the years. There's also the Code Reading Club. This is just something I'm aware of, and they do regular meetups and take blocks of code and discuss them as a group. As we say, if we're reading code 60% of the time, why not put more time into becoming better at it? And then finally, there's a book called The Programmer's Brain. I'm only just starting to read it myself, and it's a really interesting book. And it goes through some of the psychology of reading code, about what makes it easy to read, how your brain works when it's trying to remember different types of code, and various other bits and pieces. So if you're interested in the topic, I definitely recommend that book there. And that brings me to the end of 15 minutes. So thank you for listening to me. As I say, you can find me on Twitter at John Kilmister, should you have any questions. And thank you for listening to me. I'm now going to pass over to Amir.